Welcome to Weekend Office Hours with Professor Paul Denary. My name is Sirish Pulusani. Welcome back, Paul.
Hey there, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Good.
As always, we're discussing the latest events in the war in Ukraine. The big news yesterday is the European Commission, which is the executive arm of the EU, has proposed that Ukraine become a membership candidate to join the bloc, which is the first step, apparently, on this road to membership to the European Union. So obviously, I just want to understand the implications of this and what you think about this.
Yeah, this is big. This is big, but it's not. It's big in one way immediately, and in another way, it's not. It's big only in the long term. It's big immediately in that it's a huge boost for Ukraine in terms of morale. They've been asking for a path towards EU membership really for almost 30 years, but the state of reform in Ukraine combined with a lack of enthusiasm in Europe has meant that they've never really gotten close to it. And so when the war started, Zelensky said, you should let us in. And so saying Ukraine is going to be a candidate, meaning what candidate status means is now you've got to do a whole bunch of stuff to bring your laws and your practices and so on in alignment with existing EU regulations, what's called the acquis communautaire. That's French for something. And once you've done that, right, we can then take a vote on your membership. So in the short term, it means very little formally in the sense that it will take Ukraine years to do the things that are necessary to get it even ready for a vote. But in the short term, it's a huge win for Ukraine and for Volodymyr Zelensky, the president. From my perspective, as somebody who's been studying Ukraine for 30 years, the reason it's so important is that there's, if you look at the other former communist countries in Europe, they've been able to reform largely because the EU has been sort of dangling membership in front of them. And I'm thinking about Poland, 25 years ago. The EU is dangling membership in front of them and giving an immense amount of technical assistance on how you actually do reform. And so it's very hard, of course. Anytime you're doing reform, there's going to be people who are against it. But when you're able to say, we've got to do this because if we don't, we won't get into the EU, it completely shifts the balance of power in domestic reform discussions. Now, that all seems a little bit hypothetical while Ukraine's still at war, but in the medium to long term, it gives reformers in Ukraine leverage that they've never had before. So it's incredibly important.
So let's talk about this some more, because to become a member, a country must first meet the Copenhagen criteria, which we could talk about more detailed. But essentially, it requires a stable democracy that respects human rights and rule of law, a functioning market economy, and the acceptance of the obligations of membership, including EU law. So does Ukraine fit that criteria at this point, or does a lot of reform need to happen?
I think we could argue about Ukrainian democracy. It was in pretty good shape before the Russians invaded. The big issue will be Ukrainian law. One of the reasons the Brits left the European Union is they didn't like all the European law. And we're not just talking about a few laws. We're talking about basically all the regulations that run a country, right? Emissions regulations on automobiles, health regulations, criminal justice regulations. It's an immense amount of stuff. It's volumes and volumes and volumes of regulations. And so it will take a long time, even in the best of circumstances, to rewrite Ukrainian laws and to pass, hundreds or thousands of pieces of legislation needed to change Ukrainian law and regulation in order to put it into compliance. I'll just give you one example of why this is not such a big deal in the short term, other than symbolically. Turkey was made an EU candidate member in 1987. 1987. As of today, Turkey is still not an EU member, and as of 2016, the negotiations over Turkish membership basically stopped because of Turkey's human rights issues. So in other words, and I think one of the reasons why the EU leaders, these three EU heads of government that went to Kiev this week, were willing to support it, is they fully understand that they're not committing themselves to anything. They're committing themselves to starting a process, but not to any end of the process.
It says EU is discussing fast-tracking this bid. What does that mean?
Well, they can, fast and EU are terms that are normally not used together. The EU sort of ethos and philosophy is we move slowly, we move carefully, we move in consensus, and that way when things get done, they're done. There has been talk of accelerating the normal process because of the extenuating circumstances in Ukraine. I think that's likely to actually be divisive within the European Union. And in my opinion, while politically that would be a huge benefit for Ukraine, I actually think that for Ukraine, it's better not to skip any steps because of the because what it means is reform of Ukrainian institutions. And I would not want to skip those steps, even if I wanted to get it done faster. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, the importance of the EU is partly being admitted to the free trade area, which Ukraine already has a fair amount of access to. But it's also, again, it's the transformation of domestic institutions. And I wouldn't want to skip any of that.
What does this mean in the short term? Just this that the EU is talking about this, that Ukraine is talking about this, and what is the Russian response going to be?
Well, so Putin, another thing that happened this week was Putin gave a big speech this week at an economic conference up in St. Petersburg, an economic conference that used to draw lots of people from around the world and now is drawing people from Cuba and Venezuela and Kazakhstan. He said apparently, and I want to chase this down and see exactly what he said, but apparently he said that he doesn't object to EU membership for Ukraine. That surprises me if it's true. Because the whole, or at least one of the alleged reasons for this war in the first place was really to end independent Ukrainian statehood, right? Take over Kiev and so on. So, and I should point out that, way back in the early 2000s, Putin said he didn't object to Ukraine joining NATO. So I'm not sure we should take him at his word. I think what Putin will see this is as another attempt by the West to pry Ukraine away from Russia due to hostility aimed at Russia coming from the United States. Putin also said in the same speech, he basically said the European Union has given up its independence. It's a creature of the United States. Now, again, I think that's a propaganda. I don't think he really believes that. That's aimed at the European left and the European right, but that's what he says.
I mean, he could be using this as a way for internal purposes to kind of boost morale in Russia, further bolster his point that Ukraine is acting on behalf of, the United States and the West, essentially, as far as the fact that he was okay with Ukraine joining NATO. Maybe, if he thinks it's just not going to happen or so far off from happening, he's just like, whatever, right?
I think that's exactly it. It's like, Ukraine can join NATO, but we're going to run it when it does. Right?
Yeah. So he's not really being conciliatory. He's just kind of.
I said NATO. I meant Ukraine can join NATO.
And let's talk about this a little bit, the distinction here, because the EU is primarily an economic and political group, an alliance, I guess, in some degree, but NATO is a defensive alliance. There is some overlap in membership here, but what are the key differences here? I mean, can you explain this a little bit?
It's a good question. Yeah. NATO is a military alliance. And basically the core of it is this Article 5 that says if you attack any NATO member, you attack all of us, right? To the extent that there is integration because of NATO, it's military integration. There is a NATO headquarters in Brussels, and there's a lot of coordination militarily between the various armies of those states. But that's what it is, right? And even that is limited, right? They've done a lot of work over the years, but there's still a struggle to make sure everybody's buying compatible weapon systems, compatible communication systems, and so on. So there are no, for example, NATO troops. There are troops that are American troops, German troops, whatever, that are rotated into NATO assignments. And so there's always this concern about interoperability. But it's actually very constrained. It's very circumscribed. It's in military affairs only. And that's one of the reasons that NATO expanded more quickly after the end of the Cold War than the EU did. Because if you were looking for some way to reassure the countries of Eastern Europe quickly, it was fairly easy to let them into NATO. They needed democratic governments. democratic civil military relations, and some commitment to sort of doing the military stuff. That was a pretty easy bar to reach if you decided to do it. Whereas with the EU, even the states that were most gung-ho to join the EU, it was going to take years, if not decades, of what I said before, rewriting legislation and so on. So the first round of EU expansion, I don't think it came until 2004. It just took longer because there's so much more technical level work to do.
Mm-hmm. Is there overlap? I mean, there is overlap, but are there EU nations that are not a part of NATO? And adding on to that, what happens if an EU nation is invaded by a non-EU nation? What is the obligation of the member?
Well, so this is one of the interesting questions. Is over the years, the EU has sought to develop more of a unified foreign policy presence. They now have a sort of a head foreign policy person, and they've struggled. They've sought to have a defense identity as well. So far, it's not amounted to much because most of these states don't have tons of troops. And while they're already sort of focused in part on NATO, so they formed some fairly small joint EU battalions. I think they're battalions, some fairly small joint formations. But if anything big happens, right, they've got to turn to NATO and to the United States. Now, there are EU members that are not NATO members and vice versa. And I'm not sure I can get the comprehensive list for you at the moment. But two of the important ones right now are Finland and Sweden, both members of the EU, not yet members of NATO. Norway, a longtime member of NATO, has never been a member of the EU.
Why is that?
It's because Norway has such a different economic model based largely in oil, North Sea oil, and to some extent fisheries, that it has not wanted to subject its fisheries in particular to EU regulation, right? Because it doesn't want ships from all over the EU coming and catching its salmon.
Oh, okay, so that makes sense.
And they have less need for the EU because they have oil revenue.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of there's a reason not to and a reason why they don't need it as much.
That makes sense. So the takeaway here is this could take years, even decades, if it even happens. So this is just something that they are saying, but it can have like implications on the morale of troops in Ukraine. It could bolster reforms in Ukraine that could potentially be helpful. But beyond that, there's likely nothing too significant that's going to come of it in the short term. Would that be correct?
I don't think it's very relevant to the fighting of the war.
Mm-hmm.
I think if and when this war ends, it will be absolutely central for what happens in Ukraine afterwards. Yeah.
Is economic assistance a part of this? That happens?
Almost certainly. Much of the technical assistance needed to come into compliance with EU law and regulation has been provided by the EU, and that's going to be one of the major points against it for some EU members. Right, some EU members who have already been receiving a lot of aid from the EU might not want that aid being diverted to Ukraine. And there's another bunch of states that are kind of already in the waiting room, not just Turkey, but Serbia, a couple of the other Balkan states. And so there's going to be a debate in Europe as to sort of who gets priority and why. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would point out that is important as well is that along with this, I believe that the EU also that they supported a candidate status for Moldova, and that's interesting. It gets at the internal EU dynamics. France has always supported Romania and Moldova because they are Romance language speaking countries, and so there's always been connections between France and those two. But Moldova is interested because there's a slice of Moldova that has been controlled by Russian troops. Or Russian proxy forces since 1992. Mm-hmm. So it's another potential friction point between the EU and Russia.
And so what happens if Moldova joins the EU?
I think that the EU will probably pick up its efforts to try to resolve this conflict between Moldova and its pro-Russian separatists, or its Russia-backed separatists, I really should call them. It'll be an interesting thing because you wonder at what point, especially if Moldova really begins to develop economically, at what point some of those separatists might say, boy, maybe we'd be better off in Moldova rather than just like living off whatever we can get from Russia.
For these former Soviet bloc countries, I think you brought up Slovenia, who have joined the EU.
Yep.
Has it been,
Yep.
just a net positive for them from doing that, like major economic reforms, political reforms from joining the EU?
I think there's some debate. I think in most cases, economically, it's been hugely beneficial. You look at standards of living in places like Poland, Czech Republic, and so on. They've done extremely well. But, with any change, there are winners and losers. Some industries might not do so well in competition with European producers. And so there's always been some people who've been against it. And again, the British just chose to leave because there were certain aspects of EU regulations they didn't like. One of the places where people push back against the EU is on human rights. And this could potentially be an interesting issue in Ukraine. If human rights, everybody's in favor of human rights, especially if you've had the Russians committing atrocities in your territory. But when human rights comes around to rights for gay and lesbian and transgender people, some people in some countries start saying, "Wait a second, this is more human rights than we want." And so this will be important.
Mm-hmm. Was there ever a potential for Russia to join the EU, especially in the Boris Yeltsin years?
There was talk about it, but Russia never pushed that very hard because Russia has always wanted. It's sort of been a mutual agreement that it wasn't the right match. Russia wants to sort of like Norway. Russia wants to protect its domestic producers. It doesn't want its domestic market subject to EU regulation. Mm-hmm. So the Russian goal, and this has been part of the kind of clash of the immovable object and the irresistible force, going back to the 90s, is Russia wants to be in Europe but not constrained by European rules. And it's like, well, how does that work? And nobody knows the answer to that yet. Mm-hmm.
The EU, I guess, they're considered kind of this superpower, right? It's the United States, it's China, and it's the EU.
Yep.
EU. Is that fair to say? Are they united enough to be considered a superpower?
Well, I think it was Henry Kissinger back when he was in politics, famously said, if you phone up the EU, who picks up the phone?
Yeah.
His point being that because it was at that time, I think 12, but now 30. Independent states, there's no there. It's still a bunch of independent states, and there's nobody who really speaks for the EU. I would put it slightly differently, which is that economically, the EU is a superpower on a par with the United States and China. Mm-hmm. Militarily, no. In part, they haven't made the investments. And then you're talking about 30 separate militaries rather than one big one. Mm-hmm. Economically, you can treat it as a single economy. Militarily, you can't treat it as a single military. So if you're talking about economic affairs, it's a powerhouse. Mm-hmm. But if you're talking about rockets and bombs, not so much.
The United States started off as a collection of states, essentially, and then
Correct.
They were united by some certain common themes, and I think it became a nation. Is there any parallels to this where or are the ethnic differences just too much for us to ever consider the EU becoming something similar?
This has been a big question for the EU from the beginning. Is it going to be an international organization? Is it going to be something more than that, an economic union? Is it eventually going to become a federated state like the United States? The original founders of the EU, and it's in the EU founding documents, use this language, ever closer union, right? In order to promote an ever closer union. But there's a big division of opinion as to whether the goal should be eventually a United States of Europe, or whether the goal should always be to keep the separate states separate. In the United States, it took decades and some wars and some other things to really forge the notion of a single ethnos and a single nation and a single people. Mm-hmm.
It took a civil war.
Took the Civil War, of course, but in many respects, it took World War I and the economic measures of World War I to really form a single economy and to really make the federal government more relevant to people's lives or as relevant as the state goes.
It increased the power of the federal government to a great degree, essentially.
Exactly. And one of the things that you see in Europe is to the extent that Europe, that things are getting decided in Brussels rather than in Berlin. People seem to resent that, right? For years and years and years, it was talked about the democratic deficit in the European Union, because you elect your representative to the German parliament. You do elect a representative to a European parliament that meets in Strasbourg in France, but the European Parliament doesn't really control legislation, right? The thing that controls like laws is the European Commission and the European Council. The Commission being the bureaucracy and the Council being the collection of the heads of government.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the average person, they didn't have that same sense of, I'm electing a representative that's making my laws. The only person that the Germans were voting for who was really making their laws, was a chancellor, mm-hmm. who is, elected indirectly anyhow because it's chosen by the German parliament. Mm-hmm. So there's always been this concern about a democratic deficit in the European Union. The last thing I'll say is, and this is very relevant to Ukraine and to the other potential entrances, there's a big, if you get back to this question of United States of Europe, right? There's a big debate. Should the next big goal of the European Union should be to broaden or to deepen? And there's always been that debate as well.
That's fascinating. I mean, that's a great thing. And sometimes those two things are at odds, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's shift the discussion a little bit here to what's actually taking place on the ground in Ukraine. The Russians are pretty close to taking Severodonetsk. Can you give us an update on the progress of the battle there? One of the things I've read is that the Ukrainians are putting themselves in a lot of risk by continuing to hold out. Is there a strategy here?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. There was an article in the New York Times maybe about a week ago basically saying, that American analysts understand Russia's strategy better than Ukraine's strategy. And that the Ukrainians have held their cards very close to the vest, in part, I think, because they don't necessarily want the Russians to know what the strategy is, but that also leaves out the people they're relying on for weapons. And I'll come back to that. But the dilemma is, in Severodonetsk right now, is do you try to hold out for control of this important city? But if you hold out, number one, just a lot of people might get killed, but even worse, if you hold out in Severodonetsk where the Russians are moving around, those troops could get cut off and they could all get captured. And that's a sort of a classic dilemma in war that happened again and again in World War II. Here's what I think the Ukrainians are doing, and this gets back to the question of strategy. Maybe they're just being stubborn because they don't want the morale loss of having to abandon a city. Maybe it's political, not military strategy that we're seeing here. But I actually think that there is a military strategy. And I should say that Dmytro Kuleba, who's the foreign minister, published an article in Foreign Affairs this week, sort of laying out, basically saying, yes, we have a strategy and here's what it is. Sort of meeting these criticisms that the West doesn't know what Ukraine's strategy is. It didn't get as detailed into the strategies as I would have liked. But the strategy appears to be this, right? They're fighting in the city of Severodonetsk. Urban fighting is very slow and takes a huge toll on the attacker. So I think the idea is that, yes, even if Ukraine is going to suffer some losses here, the Russians are going to suffer as many or more, and it's going to be very slow going. The bigger Ukrainian strategy seems to be, right, the Russians came into this war with an army with, roughly 300,000 men in it, and we've already taken a lot of them out, and that if we can continue to grind them in this way, their capacity to prosecute the war will be diminished. That's sort of step one, is we just keep the meat grinder going in Severodonetsk. Step two is, and as we wear them out, we then begin to bring soldiers places where they don't have enough soldiers to defend, like in southern Ukraine around Kherson. Now, the key part of this strategy is that they get long-range weapons from the United States, which are necessary both to prevent the kind of stuff that's happening in Severodonetsk, but also to go on the offensive elsewhere in Ukraine.
What are these weapons?
Well, they're talking about a system whose name I'm now going to forget, but it's basically, there's two kinds of systems we're talking about. One is 155 millimeter artillery pieces, which we've given them some of, but the numbers just aren't there, whereas the Russians have thousands of artillery tubes and hundreds of thousands or millions of shells, and so they're just out shelling the Ukrainians right now. The American artillery pieces have a longer range, so they're much more effective and they're much more accurate. So you actually need fewer shells. Mm-hmm. But they're also looking for the system that I can't remember the acronym for it, so forgive me. But it's rather than being artillery, shot out of basically a cannon, these are missiles. So it's the same function as artillery, but they're rockets rather than shells. Mm-hmm. And they have a much longer range. And so you can really begin to do things to an opponent's defenses while you remain safe. Mm-hmm. Well, the United States has hesitated. There's a couple of versions of this that have different ranges, and the United States is very worried about giving Ukraine stuff that Ukraine could actually use to attack Russia itself.
Have they not done that at all yet?
Of course they have. And so, I think that this hesitation, mm-hmm. It wouldn't be very hard for the Americans and the Ukrainians to come up to an agreement that says, we'll give you these weapons, but you won't shell Russia with them. And if you do, we'll stop giving you the ammunition for them.
And Putin knows this is happening already.
Yeah, this is. I read it in the newspaper.
So he's aware of it. Let's talk about this some more, though. So the United States has given, I think, almost $5.6 billion in aid since the war started in February. This has been used for weapons, all sorts of different things. What is the United States' role in this? Meaning, if the United States did not do this, for instance, would the course of the war be so significantly different right now?
Yes.
Yeah. And so it's essential, in your mind, that the U.S. continues to support.
Yes. We can argue about the should part, but I don't think there's any debate that Ukraine's ability to prosecute the war goes up or down with the amount and type of weaponry that the United States sends its way. And there are a lot of other countries sending weapons as well. But if you look at the quantity, by far the biggest portion is coming from the United States. Mm-hmm. And if the United States were to, like tomorrow, say we're not shipping any more weapons to Ukraine, I don't think the rest of Ukraine's supporters could make up the difference. Mm-hmm. So it's not completely America-centric to talk about the United States being the key player.
Is there any sense that these weapons and even the money is being used in an effective manner? Is there any way to even gauge that?
I think there are two. I think the military people will tell you that the effects of these weapons are they're incontrovertible. Whether it's the drones that have been coming from Turkey or the Switchblade drones from the United States or these long-range artillery pieces or various other things, javelins in particular, but also British anti-tank weapons. The weapons that Ukraine has been getting from abroad have been having a central impact on their ability to resist Russia's advances. I don't think anybody disputes that. Mm-hmm. The things that people dispute are, okay, so what's the American strategy, the Western strategy? How does this get us towards peace, right? And there are those who basically say that and this is what Russia says, but also a lot of people in the West, by arming the Ukrainians, all you're doing is prolonging a war and getting more people killed. And we should try to get to the end in a faster and less violent way. And then there are those who are going to say, I heard somebody this week say, somebody I don't know very well, but clearly is a smart person, basically saying, I just paid $5 a gallon for gasoline, and Biden's sending money to Ukraine.
Where's the $5 gas? Because
that's what I was $7
gas down the road over here.
I can tell you this person does not live. This person does not live in California. Now, you mentioned, what was the number you mentioned? $5 billion?
Yeah, $5.6 billion in aid has been delivered so far, and that's a fraction of the actual aid that's being promised.
Yeah. So, I hate to say this, but $5 billion in the scope of the U.S. budget is nothing. The U.S. military budget is pushing, $800 billion these days. So $5 billion is nothing. And in terms of the American economy, which is in the trillions, it's not relevant, but to someone like you or me, $5 billion sounds like a lot of money, right? So as somebody famously said, sooner or later it starts adding up. I think that what you're getting at and what I have been thinking a little bit about is how long does the public support in the West, including the United States, to supply weapons to Ukraine, how sustainable is that? Economically, because I think that the numbers are actually very low in terms of our government spending. Economically, we could sustain it as long as we choose to. The question is, at what point is there a perception that politicians are looking after others abroad when they should be looking after us?
Yeah, and the main point being is inflation is on the rise. We're very likely about to enter a pretty significant recession right now. Things are not going to be well for the economy, and it's about to hit very hard, I'm sure. That being said, what is the direct effect? I mean, and let's just talk about one example here, which is gas prices. What is the direct effect? First of all, Ukraine and Russia, they are oil-producing nations, so that probably has an impact. But then also the aid, right, that we do send to them. So what is the impact of this war on our gas prices?
Conflict always drives fuel prices up. And in the medium to long term, I think it should be moderated. There have been other forces. I mean, this is the thing I think we need to recognize as far as inflation goes. The Ukraine war has made bad a situation that was already bad, which is the supply chain issues. I mean, the inflation in the United States really comes, there's two sides of it, right? There's money chasing goods, and the supply of goods went down because of supply chain issues due to COVID. And the money chasing those goods went up because in order to protect people from COVID, the federal government sent everybody a check last year and the year before, right? So you all of a sudden had lots of money chasing fewer goods. Supply, demand, right? Prices go up. That's really what we're seeing. What has now got thrown on top of that, especially in the energy markets and in the food markets, is the disruptions of those markets because of this war, especially in natural gas. Right. So I'll just give you an example of how this works. Last week, one of these facilities that turns natural gas into liquid so it can be shipped overseas down in the Houston area had a fire or had some kind of accident and it shut down. So the price of natural gas in the United States went down because because not as much gas could be shipped off to Europe. So essentially, right, the Russians cut off the supply of gas to Europe, or the Europeans say we're going to stop buying Russia's gas. That drives up the demand for everybody else's gas, and that drives prices up. Mm-hmm. More or less the same thing is happening with oil. Oil, I think, will be better in the long run because it's much easier to move oil around the world. So as India starts buying oil from Russia, because India is willing to do that, India will buy less oil elsewhere, and that oil will remain on the market. Mm-hmm. But there are all kinds of issues involved in the supply chains around the world right now. Until they adjust to what's going on with this war, the prices are going to be super high. Mm-hmm. The Iran-Iraq war in 1979, drove one of the previous gigantic spikes in gas prices and oil prices. Prior to that, it was the Arab oil embargo in 1973. And I know we're going back a long way in history, but I'm doing that for a reason, which is there's a word that when I was in college, high school, and I'm talking a long time ago now, was a commonly heard word. That word was stagflation. And you're now hearing that term again, stagflation.
Can you explain that word?
I can, because I lived through the 80s. Stagflation is a combination of two words, stagnation and inflation. Typically, like the standard economic model says that when inflation is high, the economy is booming, right? And when you've got a recession, inflation comes down. And it's got to do with demand, right? When you've got a recession, there's less demand in the economy, so inflation comes down. So in theory, you should never have high inflation and low growth at the same time. Mm-hmm. Stagflation is high inflation with low growth. And it looks like that's what we're headed into now. The Fed said this week, and the Fed raised the basic interest rate by 0.75 of a percentage point this week, which is a huge bump. And they said, we can still avoid having stagflation. But of course, these are the same guys that said a year ago we could still avoid inflation, mm-hmm. and nobody really believes them anymore. So we could be in this very difficult situation, you say 6 months from now, in which unemployment begins to go up in the United States, even as the price of goods is going up at the same time. Mm-hmm. And again, in the late 70s, early 80s, that was the standard thing. And it was driven primarily by the shocks to commodities.
At the risk of wading into political territory here, maybe theoretically the stagflation might have even brought down the presidency of Jimmy Carter, right, or caused him not to get.
Oh, absolutely.
And then the ascendancy of Ronald Reagan, essentially, in 1980, right? Is that something that you see that might happen to Biden? And actually, in the way it affects the war, obviously, is if we have a change in administration, even if it's Trump. He might. I can see a really big scenario where he's like, no aid to Ukraine, right?
Yep. It's not a huge stretch to imagine that if the economy looks, 2 years from now like it does now, that it's going to be tough for Biden to get reelected. The single best predictor, it's not a perfect predictor, the single best predictor of how the incumbent party does in a presidential election is the state of the economy. More to the point, we have midterm elections this fall, and we could very easily go from this very narrow Democratic majority and basically a tied Senate and a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives to the Republicans controlling both houses. Mm-hmm. And so, at that point, you've got Republicans controlling both houses, Democrats controlling the presidency, and nothing happens for 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll just have to see how it goes, but there's a lot of different scenarios on how this can potentially play out. Any other, insights onto the inflation, how this war is going to change, our support? Just thinking about it, when hard times falls on America, yes, we are not going to be open to doing the necessary steps potentially, right?
Here's I think what's interesting, Sirish. I'm not sure that the U.S. government or that the sort of mainstream elite in U.S. foreign policy has yet fully come to grips with how long I think this war is likely to go. Mm-hmm. That is to say, I would love to see Biden come out and saying to the American people, we may be doing what we're doing now or even more of it, and it may take 5 years. Mm-hmm. Because I believe in being honest with the American people. My sense is that's the last thing he wants to do. He would rather just kind of see it push along and turn into 5 years, because that probably can fly below the radar politically, the way that we all forgot about the Iraq war after a couple of years. But what's important to recognize is that with except for the far left and the far right, there is consensus, in Washington on support for Ukraine and on opposition to Russia. This is one of the ways in which Russia really did immense damage to itself by interfering in the 2016 presidential election. So I'll just give you an example of one person who's been a potential presidential candidate, right? Marco Rubio of Florida. Very clearly sees political benefit, right? But I think probably also believes that we absolutely have got to stand up to Russia, and supporting Ukraine is the way to do that. There's a Republican for you, right? Normally he'd be criticizing Biden. But this has been true since the Trump years. It's the only thing Republicans and Democrats agree on. Mm-hmm. So I actually think, in a general sense, at least inside the Beltway, the support for Ukraine is pretty robust. What will be interesting to see is if eventually forces from outside the Beltway begin to undermine that.
Mm-hmm. Let me just get on that point real quick, because every time we hear Trump speak, he seems to speak about this in pretty ambiguous terms. He's not clearly stating this and maybe the way that we would expect. So what is there a fear here for Ukraine, for you, obviously, who studies this? If there is a second Trump presidency, what's going to happen?
Well, look, I think there's an immense fear for American democracy if there's a second Trump administration. In two respects. One is, after what Trump did, on January 6th, 2021, and everything before that, the fact that many, right, even after all that, he's got so much support, basically says that there's a lot of people in this country who are willing to sacrifice democracy for some other goals. Mm-hmm. But more to the point, what do the institutions of this country look like after another 4 years of Donald Trump? That's not the question you asked, but that's important because, if the United States sort of becomes embroiled in its own stuff, will it even be in a situation to provide the kind of support to Ukraine that Ukraine needs? And I think the answer is that's diminished. Mm-hmm. What I think is tougher to predict is, in terms of Russia and Ukraine, which version of Donald Trump would we get as president, right? Do we get the one that coddles dictators or the one who stands up to them? The one who says, who says that if he were president, this never would have happened, or the one who can't seem to find enough nice things to say about Putin, and seems perfectly happy to throw Ukraine under the bus. I think it'll be very difficult to predict.
Well, one of the things is, you're in this world, Paul, but my general sense is this war has fallen off most people's
Absolutely.
radar. Just in general, like maybe not keeping up with current events, not really understanding it. Obviously, the U.S. is continuing to send aid and has a major impact on global issues, but it doesn't seem like many Americans are really kind of following this closely. Should they be? What is the implications of this, that they're not?
Yes and no, which is the United States can, as I was sort of saying earlier, the United States can maintain the level of support it's been maintaining for Ukraine or double it without it being a significant impact in the United States federal budget or the economy. That's just not of the same order of magnitude. So in that sense, we don't need to worry about it. We can keep on supplying them for a long time. I think in the bigger sense, in the human sense, we should continue to follow it. But I'm sympathetic because look, there's catastrophes all over the world, and this is only one of them. And it's the one that I'm focused on. But a reasonable person could say, well, what about famine in Ethiopia? And of course, we've talked about this. There's going to be a lot more famine coming as a result of this war. So, the good news is the United States can continue to support Ukraine without it really directly affecting the average American. I think that the bad news is because of the potential for it to turn into a bigger conflict, it would be a good thing if the American people were abreast with what's going on.
Great insights as always, Paul, and hopefully people are gaining some knowledge and information about this conflict through our conversations here.
I hope so.
I certainly am. So this has been great. We will continue again next weekend. This is weekend office hours. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining me.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.